Hey, book lovers. Want to hear a story? Welcome back to Storytime with Em. This is a mini episode from Em's Books and Cats podcast, where I am sharing my book, SuperGym, a chapter or sometimes two a week. Now, quick trigger warning on this. This book contains adult content, so if you are not an adult, this book is not for you. Now, please enjoy Chapter 11 of SuperGym. Sirens blared. Thor jumped to his feet. He knocked a plate onto the floor and it exploded into thousands of little shards. White needles. Someone was in the yard. It was after curfew. Dinner was over, and everyone should have been preparing to sleep. Thor kicked a piece of plate across the floor. The clients were not allowed outside of the city. His home should have been a safe haven from the whining, crying wretches he saw every day. He went to the console on the wall and typed in a password. Bright lights illuminated the night, and he saw Maggie. Of course it's Maggie. He threw open the door and stormed outside. "What are you doing here?" "I got lost. I was riding home and blacked out." "Who brought you here?" Thor regretted not checking his messages as soon as the tablet beeped. He'd been wrapped up in planning Maggie's workouts and had dismissed the notification. Maggie had missed curfew. He should have been the first to know. Maggie's face was washed out by the bright lights. The bones of her face cast a shadow that gave her a skeletal look. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her middle, and she was trembling. "Trent?" "You met Trent." His chest was tight. The air rushed from his lungs, and he suddenly couldn't breathe. He gripped the doorframe with his thick fingers to keep from swaying. Maggie wasn't looking at him. She stood staring at her feet. "I passed out. He was there when I woke up. He said you would already know all of this." Thor looked angry, but he didn't reply. He took her hands and pulled her inside the house. He punched in another code on the console. The door locks clicked, and the lights went out. The world outside was once again plunged into darkness. Thor's home was stark and bare. One chair, one table. A metal spiral staircase led to the second level, which she assumed held his bedroom. A little shiver of excitement went up her spine at the thought. Thor watched her. She was still wearing her neon gym clothes. Her hair was wild and knotted. Her eyes lingered on the stairs, and he wanted to drag her into his bedroom and destroy her. No. He banished the thought instantly. There wasn't time for that. He needed to figure out his plan of attack. He hadn't seen her information, hadn't been prepared for his late-night visitor. The message light was flashing on his tablet. He tapped the screen and skimmed the message. Trent. She met Trent. That was a problem. Thor didn't like Trent. He was dangerous. As Maggie's trainer, it was Thor's duty to keep her safe. Trent had not dared to step onto his property this time. Their last meeting ended with both men in the hospital, and Thor's recovery had been slow. Mr. Pratt's face had been purple with rage. Thor was out of commission for 5 days. Almost an entire week. Anything more than a day was unacceptable. Trainers were the ideal. They were the picture of a healthy life. Being sick was not part of the program. Thor should have been fired, but Mr. Pratt let him stay. He gave Trent a new assignment. Thor received a stern lecture, and the incident was never mentioned again. Now Maggie was here, and he was in trouble again. Thor didn't like trouble. Trainers and clients were not allowed to socialize. Mr. Pratt could never find out. Thor would not get another chance. She was waiting for him to speak. Thor felt strangely uncomfortable and nervous. He'd never been at a loss for words before. When Maggie was around, he couldn't think. His mouth went dry, and his throat closed. "What happens now?" Her voice was quiet, and she refused to look at him. She was seated on the only chair and had pulled up her knees to her chest. Her legs were dirty, and her tangled brown hair fell over her face. Somehow, she still managed to stir something in Thor. A strange sensation sat heavily in the pit of his stomach. Thor didn't like feelings. They made him feel ill. They made him ill. You shouldn't be here, but it's too late to bring you home. You have a curfew too? She lifted her head and her bright eyes met his. Thor's stomach gave another nauseating flip. He moved quickly across the room to lean on the fridge. When he stood close to the shiny metal, his reflection was hidden. He didn't want her to see him at his worst. He waved his hand at her dismissively. Of course. Adequate sleep is necessary for fat loss. You're not fat. He smiled. There is always room for improvement. Maggie didn't know what to say. Thor was a monster. Cold, heartless torture was his forte. But this Thor was different. His smile was a little sad. He seemed uncertain and possibly insecure. Did he actually think he was fat? Use this against him. How? Other Maggie didn't have an answer. She didn't think she could use it against him. It was too mean. Maggie knew how much it hurt. But who was it that hurt you? Thor. He still hurts you. He has no compassion. This is a game. He's playing you. You need to play him. Thor was sweating just a little along his hairline. His hands were tightly clasped, and his knuckles were white against his deep tan. He looked nervous. Why was he so nervous? You can sleep upstairs tonight. I'll sleep down here. You don't need to worry. I'm not like Mr. Pratt. Maggie's cheeks grew hot. She looked away in shame. He knew. Of course he knew. He knows. Everyone knows. He thinks you're disgusting. Always so helpful, other Maggie. She followed Thor up the stairs. His room was sparsely furnished. His bed was a simple metal frame. No mattress. A thin black blanket was folded at the foot of the bed, and a pristine, though lumpy pillow sat at the top of it. This is where you sleep. Yes. Why? I guess I thought trainers would be treated better. Some are. I chose to live a simple life. Helps me stay focused. Now get into bed. He handed her the pillow and covered her with the scratchy blanket. The metal beneath her was cold, and she shivered a little. Thor stood over her a moment longer. He didn't say a word. His rugged face was a mask. His eyes were slightly darker than usual, and his gaze was empty. No emotions. Then he blinked and gave his head a small shake. He turned and bolted down the spiral staircase. The metal rung shook with his every step. His hand slapped the wall on his way out, and she was alone in the darkness. Maggie sat up and quickly surveyed the room. It was small, about half the size of the downstairs. There was a small window near the ceiling, but it was out of reach. The walls were polished stone. There were a few cracks, but nothing big enough for a foothold. There were no other options. There was a bathroom off of one wall, but it was a tiny windowless cubicle. Why is it so much smaller on the inside? Good question. The tower was massive. It rose high above the tops of the trees surrounding it, and it was wide. There had to be more than just a few bare rooms. Maggie got out of bed and padded quietly across the floor. She went to the far wall and examined it closely. Her nose brushed against the cold stone as she studied every tiny crack in the smooth surface. Hours passed, but Maggie was unaware of the time. The moon was high and full. A shaft of brilliant white light shone through the window and illuminated a small patch of wall. Maggie saw it then. There was a line. More than just a crack. It was too straight, too perfect. It began at a place just above her head and ran straight up to join with another line. This line cut across the wall and joined another. A door. It was a secret door. Maggie pushed on the smooth stone until she heard a soft click. The door swung inward and revealed only darkness. Maggie climbed through the door and found herself on another twisted metal staircase. There was nothing but darkness below. She hesitated. Her heart was pounding in her ears, but she inched her foot slowly forward, searching out the next step. There was no going back now. She descended slowly, step by step down into the complete darkness. She tried not to imagine what waited below. You really don't want to know. Probably not. Maggie paused and her hands groped the empty blackness. Nothing. She crept carefully down another step, and another. She had to be on the first level by now, but the staircase continued down, down, down. Above her, the door quietly clicked shut. She had not truly been in darkness until that moment. The pale, barely visible light from the bedroom had not provided much, but it had been a focal point. It broke up the monotonous black. Maggie felt lightheaded, and she froze. Her chest grew tight. Her lungs burned as she fought for air. Don't panic. Panic. Maggie shook her head and closed her eyes. The darkness was the same, but she felt better, as if she could open her eyes right now and find herself safe in her old apartment. Maggie knew it wasn't true, but she found it calming anyway. She tried to focus on taking another breath, a slightly bigger breath. She relaxed just a little, and the sweet air rushed in, soothing her burning lungs. Maggie could breathe again. She took one long, shuddering breath after another. Her heart was still pounding in her ears, but the panic was fading. She opened her eyes to the darkness. No, it was still too much. She quickly shut them again. Her paralysis ended and she was able to slide her foot out, feeling for the next step. But there wasn't one. She took a hesitant step forward and found solid ground. She reached her hand out and took another step. Her fingers brushed up against a wall, and she cried out in surprise. She ran her hands along the rough surface as she moved cautiously forward. Flakes of it crumbled away under her touch. There was a faint dripping sound. It sounded far away. Maggie reached out without letting her fingertips leave the safety of the wall. Her hand touched something wet and slimy. There was another wall to her right, just beyond her reach. There was a strange smell in the tunnel. It wasn't entirely unpleasant. The scent was familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. It grew stronger as she went, and it soon became overpowering. Maggie tried holding her breath. She felt woozy. The darkness seemed to shudder and swing around her. She could hear the dripping more clearly now. It was hard to determine how long she walked. Time had no meaning in the absolute darkness. The corridor stretched on without turning. The walls were cold and wet with a slightly sticky substance. Her hands were coated in it. The smell was getting worse. The air was thick with it. She pinched her nose and took careful, shallow breaths through her mouth. It didn't help much. The walls disappeared abruptly. Maggie felt around blindly. She was in a room, 4 walls and an open doorway. A slight breeze stirred the air. The smell had faded, and Maggie took an indulgent breath of the cool, fresh air. You can see. The faintest glimmer of light filled the cavernous room. A single torch placed high in a corner of the room gave it just enough light to see a door on the far wall. Maggie crossed the room carefully. Her footsteps echoed around her, and her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Could Thor hear her? It was late when she finally found the door, and she had no idea how long she had walked in the darkness. It felt like a long time. Morning was coming. He would discover she was missing, and he would check the tunnel first. Don't wait around for him. Move it. Maggie didn't want to meet Thor in this dark and terrible place. She picked up the pace and ran toward the light. It grew brighter as she ducked through the doorway into a wide passage. The walls oozed with a thick, wet sludge. It was black and congealed like old blood. Chains hung from the walls at intervals around the room. The sludge was thickest around them, Her stomach turned over. "Run faster!" Her footsteps echoed off the walls and crashed all around her, the sound of hundreds of feet running. The hallway veered to the left, and Maggie passed through a doorway and into another long corridor. The walls were cleaner, no sludge. They were wet and green with moss. The air smelled of trees and dirt. She took a deep breath. Maggie turned a corner and stopped short. The corridor split in two. The passages were identical. The wet stone walls and the muddy floors were exactly the same. They both ran straight for a bit and turned at the same place. One went to the left, and the other to the right. Maggie had no idea which one to choose. As she stood pondering her situation, there was a distant sound, a low thud, a scraping noise. Thor. Maggie picked the closest tunnel and sprinted down it. She turned left and plunged into the dark corridor. The light was low and her eyes did not adjust immediately. She stumbled blindly down the hall. The air was dank and heavy. A putrid cloud hung over her. Then there was a shuffling sound in the dark in front of her. Maggie stopped. There was the clink of chains and more shuffling. A thin, pale arm appeared out of the shadows. The hand clawed at the air in front of Maggie, and a dry, husky voice whispered from the darkness. "Thor, is that you?" Maggie swallowed. Her throat was suddenly impossibly dry. "No, It's not Thor." There was a long silence, then more shuffling. "Did he catch you too?" "Who? Thor? Did he do this to you?" "No, not Thor." The voice cracked and broke into a wet, barking cough. Maggie waited impatiently for it to end. It had to be Thor. Who else was there? The coughing stopped. Maggie sighed loudly. "Who are you?" "I'm Thor's best client." Maggie didn't know what to say. There was more shuffling in the shadows. A thin, gray leg appeared, followed by what was left of a face. The eyes were sunk deep in their sockets. Gray, papery skin hung in loose folds from the high cheekbones. The body was shrunken and concave. A skeleton with skin. "Look how thin I am. It's all thanks to Thor. Have you seen him? He used to visit me, but he hasn't in a long time." She tried to smile. The skin cracked and flaked away. Her mouth was a gaping hole. She had no teeth. "Get away from this hideous thing. She's dead already. Thor's coming. You need to run." Maggie backed away. The remains of Thor's best client shuffled back into the shadows. "Run!" Maggie fled. She flew down the corridor. Her legs were weary, but she pushed on. She rounded the corner and saw the steely light of morning. Fresh air. She ran faster. When she reached the opening, Maggie paused and stepped cautiously out into the forest. She could see the wall. It was a remote section hidden from the guard towers by a tangle of fallen trees. She was so close to freedom. Heavy footfalls crashed through the fallen leaves and forest debris. Maggie dove into the brush. A sharp branch pierced her skin and left a line of blood down her leg. The footsteps were getting louder. A monstrous man stepped out from behind a tree. He strode through the trees and past Maggie without noticing her. He was close enough for her to smell his cologne. He was dressed in camouflage, but moved without concern. This was his routine, and he was being careless. He didn't expect to find anyone out among the trees. She waited for him to disappear and darted away in the opposite direction. She kept close to the edge of the forest and followed the wall. Not far from the exit of Thor's dungeon was another guard tower. Maggie ducked behind a tree and peered cautiously around the trunk. After a moment, she spotted a man in the tower. He paced the perimeter of his perch with a gun held loosely in his hands. Maggie took a deep breath and moved quickly from tree to tree. She watched the guard tower closely and ducked behind the trees whenever the man appeared. He was moving at a slow, leisurely pace, and his appearances came at steady intervals. Okay, he's out of sight. Run faster. Somehow Maggie managed to keep going. Her legs were on fire and threatening to collapse underneath her. She stumbled through some thick brush. The brambles caught in her hair and scratched her face. A thin trickle of blood ran down her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. She burst through a tangle of vines and found herself at the road that would take her back to Famicili. Maggie crawled up the embankment and hesitated. What now? Maggie didn't know what to do. Could she go back and pretend that nothing had happened? Surely someone had seen her unexpected detour. There were cameras all over the city. Did they go all the way out to the wall? Of course they do, you idiot. No point in thinking about it. The only option right now is to go back and see what's waiting for us. We're not getting through the wall today. Thor knew, but she didn't think he would say anything. The SuperGym's #1 trainer could never admit that his client had disobeyed him and broken curfew, as well as countless other laws. Mr. Pratt would be furious. Thor might end up in more trouble than she was. Maggie slumped down onto a rotten log. The wood was soft under her fingers. It felt alive with the vibrations of the insects working busily beneath the surface. She had to go back. Other Maggie was right. There was no other choice. She had gone as far as she could, but there was no way over the wall. Maggie dug her nails into the log. 2 fat tears slid down her cheeks and dripped onto her legs. She didn't want to go back. You need to deal with Dr. Clyde. He's the next step. Dr. Clyde wasn't as physically intimidating as Thor, but he was unpredictable. His bland kindness and emotionless expression were a mask. She didn't know what he was hiding, but Maggie was pretty sure she didn't want to see what was underneath. All of Mr. Pratt's top people enjoyed their jobs, but Dr. Clyde seemed to like his most of all. The others had weaknesses. Even Thor had a vulnerable side. He exploded into rages. He was emotional. Dr. Clyde looked at her with clinical interest. There was no trace of feeling behind those shiny, round glasses. It was impossible to know what he was thinking, and that scared her. Maggie cast one last look at the door that led to the other side of the wall. She was so close to freedom, so close to escaping Benjamin Pratt and his SuperGyms. Maggie shook her head. She couldn't go back. She had to find a way to get to the other side of the wall. Thor was coming. Maggie could hear his steady footfalls. They were getting closer. She turned toward the sound and saw his huge frame barreling down on her at full speed. His face was a purple mask of rage. He was beside her in an instant, and his hand clamped down on her arm so hard it felt as if it would snap in two. Ow, you're hurting me. Shut up. What do you think you're doing out here? You can't be here. If they find you, we'll both be killed. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her hard. Her teeth rattled. The image of the ghastly wreck hidden in the secret corridor appeared before her. You're not going back there. Fight if you need to. Maggie was holding her breath. Lights danced in front of her eyes, and she quickly exhaled a long, defeated sigh. The anger left Thor's face. His perfect posture threatened to cave as his shoulders slumped forward just a little. He pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her. One hand held her head to his chest, and he buried his face in her hair. He inhaled deeply and sighed with pleasure. I want to help you, Maggie. I really do. But this is a game. You have to have a strategy. I can help you, but you'll have to trust me and do everything I say. She didn't trust him. Maggie wasn't buying into this new version of Thor. He was the same heartless training monster she had always known. Once again, the remains of the woman floated through her mind. Still, something made her hesitate. His face had changed. It was very subtle, but it was there. Something in his eyes. Concern. Of course he's concerned. He's worried he'll get caught. Maggie wasn't listening. She moved closer. Her body brushed against his, and her heart raced. What are you doing? Not now. His hand went to her hip, and he pulled her against him. I guess we can use this, somehow. Play along. Maggie didn't see any other choice. She lightly touched his chest. She tried to make her eyes round and innocent as she gazed up at him. Not so tight. You're hurting me. His grip loosened, but he didn't let go. Maggie leaned her head against his chest. His heart was racing. He lowered his head over her for just a moment. His breath was hot against her cheek. Then he pulled away suddenly. Maggie stumbled and fell into him, and he pushed her away. His face was flushed. His eyes darted around wildly. Beads of sweat were forming on his heavy brow. Thor ran a hand over his face, shook his head violently, and bounced up and down on the balls of his feet a few times. We have to go. Now. We have to get back to the gym before they notice we're gone. I'll say you did an early morning boot camp in the park. That will explain your clothes. Maggie looked down. Her clothes were streaked with reddish-brown smudges. She hadn't noticed them before. Her arms were black with dried slime. Thor was agitated. He shifted from one foot to the other. He clapped his hands together, and Maggie jumped. The sound was sharp in the quiet morning. Get moving. Hustle, hustle, hustle. He slapped her ass. It stung. Maggie gave a yelp of surprise and sprinted away down the road. Thor stayed on her heels the whole time. She turned once to look at him over her shoulder. His face was grim. He didn't speak but stayed just behind her and pushed her to go faster and faster. They were soon back in the city. As the bleak gray skyline opened up before her, Maggie thought again of the rolling hills and bright flowers, of the wall and Trent. How could she have lived her entire life in Famicili and never once thought to look beyond the borders? They reached the SuperGym an hour later. The rooms were already filled with clients plodding away on treadmills as their trainers paced the aisles and adjusted the machines. Maggie's head ached, and the sound of pounding feet caused bright spots of light to bloom in front of her eyes. She was drenched in sweat, and every muscle was cramping. The darkness around the periphery of her vision pulsed. Maggie knew she was close to passing out. Thor, however, looked refreshed and revitalized, much happier than before. That was a good warm-up, he said as he cracked the knuckles of his massive hands. He grinned at her with his brilliant white smile. Now get inside, and let's get to the real work. Maggie hated him so much. And that is the end of Chapter 11, Book Lovers. I hope you're still enjoying SuperGym, and I will be back next week with another chapter. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep reading.